Hello and welcome to another week of Gifted Education. We are moving into week 3 and module 3, which is really the extension of the previous week's topic, gifted identification. But today we are really zooming in on students' cognitive development, measuring intelligence, and really understanding what we mean by an intellectually advanced learner. So in this slideshow that should precede chapter 6 in your sequence, I would like to talk more about the information processing models of cognition, just provide some additional information, talk about the global concept of intelligence, give an example of intelligence assessments, and then look ahead at assignment number 2, understanding and analyzing a gifted evaluation. This is not a summary of the chapter, but more something in addition to the chapter, and I will point out which areas of the chapter you should pay special attention to. So here is a brief baseline about the biological foundations of learning that most psychologists and neuroscientists agree with. So learning has physical and chemical changes, evidence of physical and chemical changes in the brain. So we know learning happened when the physical and chemical changes occurred. And what I mean by that is learning happens when groups of neurons fire together. So a memory is basically neural systems that you activate them when you remember something. So learning is basically neural networks working throughout the brain. So earlier on, I was really hoping to generate my own image that would capture one example of an information processing system, but I failed. So instead, I present you a borrowed image with a resource where I found it. So this is one graphic representation of the information processing model of cognition, and it really shows different systems at work: sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and then it also shows with arrows how these systems interact with each other. So how does it relate to a gifted learner? So the idea is that a gifted learner would use these systems somewhat differently, both qualitatively, perhaps more efficiently in a different way, and quantitatively faster. So this is another conceptualization of information processing and its different components. This is by one of my favorite authors in education, David Souza from South Florida. He authored many books about the connection of how the brain functions and how it applies to learning. So this is his visual with very similar components that the chapter talks about. So we see the sensory register that the information comes through. Whatever is irrelevant to us is filtered out, and that input comes into our immediate memory. Then from the immediate memory, the data pass into the working memory. Again, it is in the center and also emphasized in chapter 6, the model that they presented to us. Then from working memory, our data goes into long-term storage, and all of it is affected by your self-concept. So your self-concept and different components, your emotions, for a very large part, govern what you choose to take in, what you choose to remember. In other models, you will see the word attention being very prominent in the model. So this is just another way to look at different parts of cognition. So as it relates to gifted learners, we have some students who are very fast rememberers. They're very fast learners. They can learn something and remember in very few repetitions. Then there are students who are very fast retrievers. These are the students who can recall information almost instantly. Before the question is even finished, they already know. They're ready to go. And then there are students who are both fast learners and fast retrievers. And when we measure those aspects on intelligence testing, those aspects come weigh very heavily, and in part, the fast remembering and strong memory, fast retrieval, in part, that makes that traditionally intellectually gifted learner. Since memory is such a strong component of cognition, let's quickly refresh the types of memory that we have. Now, this is just one distinction. If you dive into the topic of memory, there will probably be 30 or 40 different terms and different ways of classifying it. This is just one of them. So researchers agree that knowing that, or knowing facts, is really distinct from knowing how to do something. So those are distinct memory systems. So now let's dive a little deeper into the distinction between knowing that as opposed to knowing how. Some different terminology that may be used is declarative memory versus non-declarative memory, but we can use the terminology in the chapters. So let's go with the chapter terms. Knowing that. I know that information processing models compare our brain to a computer with the input, processing, and output. I know this fact, and we know it as semantic memory, remembering specific information. Also, I may remember facts about my personal life. For example, I went to Disney World in June of 2025. I didn't, but it's just an example of episodic memory. And generally, episodic memories are formed and remembered well, right? That's one reason to try and connect any kind of learning with some personal experience. So knowing that is different from knowing how. Those are distinct networks. And we all know the students who have an abundance of facts. They may know some incredible knowledge about a particular narrow topic, but on the other hand, they do not know how to tie their shoes. Well, tying your shoes is an example of procedural memories. Forming your letters, riding a bike, swimming. It is something that you can learn to do almost automatically, and it doesn't involve remembering facts. Here are just some retention considerations. We know as teachers, as parents, that rehearsal or doing something again, repeating it, is the key to retention. But there are a couple of considerations and a couple of terms related to rehearsal. One is we distinguish between initial and secondary rehearsal, trying something for the first time versus doing something again. And one observation I have about gifted learners is that when the concept is new and very difficult, the initial rehearsal can seem like a struggle. Why are you doing this to me? I'm not used to having a struggle. But then watch what happens a little later when the secondary rehearsal comes around. It's so quick, and you see the light bulb going off, and you can tell that they just got it. So it is true that many gifted learners, many intellectually gifted learners, do not need as many repetitions to master something. And then another consideration is rote rehearsal, which is just repeating the exact same thing that the teacher did step by step, and elaborative rehearsal, which really dips into application, trying something again in a slightly different way, or applying it in a different modality. And elaborative rehearsal leads to long-term learning far better than rote rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal is especially important for gifted learners because when they are fast learners, fast rememberers, it's really easy for them to demonstrate, yes, I got it, I know it, but it's the elaborative rehearsal that they need so that they get into the habit of not just remembering and spitting the fact back out, but applying something to a new situation. So here I created an overlay between the distinction of rote rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal and Webb's depth of knowledge chart. This is something he developed in the late 1900s, which is really just over 25 years ago, and it has become very, very influential in the field of teaching, especially. So at the level of rote rehearsal, the students are expected to just recall something and reproduce exactly as the teacher has told us. But learning will be more permanent and more lasting if we take students higher up the ladder. We can have them generalize to bigger concepts. We can take them to strategic thinking, like planning, comparing, reasoning. And then the final step is extended thinking, which is the synthesis of information, interpretation, applying it to different disciplines, connecting different disciplines. So the idea for gifted learners is really be at the depth of knowledge levels 3 and 4. So continuing the topic of rehearsal, does practice make perfect? The short answer is no, practice makes permanent. And this is especially relevant to gifted learners because they tend to learn and remember things in far fewer repetitions. So a teacher is so important here to provide that feedback so that students don't remember and don't learn to do something in the wrong way, don't develop a misconception. So for gifted learners, in this particular context, monitoring of performance and feedback are crucial. You have to really focus on micro revision of skills because they're capable of improving. And again, elaborative rehearsal is far more important than rote rehearsal. And one last consideration I wanted to share before we move into this composite concept of intelligence is the primacy recency effect or primacy recency effect. And that is the idea, a research supported finding, that we remember what came first and what came last in a lesson most of all. Something that happened in the middle we remember a little less. So why is this important, especially for gifted learners? Well, it helps us plan for most important things. First, something that needs to happen early on is core concepts that you want students to know. Definitely not pass out graded papers, definitely not make a speech about tardies, and especially relevant for gifted learners, probably not to probe for misconceptions at the very start of the lesson during that prime time, because gifted students still have misconceptions, they have great ideas, and we don't want others to inadvertently remember something that makes intuitive sense but is not quite on target. So probably it is best to probe for misconceptions a little later in the middle of the lesson, and then at the end of the lesson reiterate why that was a misconception and what is a more accurate way. So this is just a thought, again, an interesting finding from neuroscience. So in this part of the slideshow, I will present some additional perspectives on intelligence. So here's a brief intro to the topic of intelligence. First of all, there is no one definition, which makes it so fascinating, but also sometimes so frustrating. The biggest question that many cognitive psychologists ask and try to figure out is how much of intelligence is genetically determined and how much is acquired and developed over time through our interactions with the environment. And the same question can be asked about child development in general, the nature versus nurture question. One famous quote by one educational psychologist is that our development is determined 100% by our biology and 100% by our environment. An interesting metaphor for you. One of the things that most cognitive psychologists agree upon is that intelligence is not just about how quickly and how well you can remember facts, how quickly you can retrieve information that you learned, but it's about the application of skills and problem solving in novel situations. And this is something, as you look at our previous graphs and our previous diagrams of information processing, this is something those visuals don't really capture. You can understand the speed with which different systems interact with each other, but the application of skills and problem solving, I think this is where other theories come in. So we cannot talk about modern theories of intelligence without at least mentioning Howard Gardner's research on multiple intelligences. Here I have 8, but fairly recently he proposed a 9th, which is the existential intelligence. And Howard Gardner believes that these intelligences are not just competencies, there are fairly autonomous systems of intelligence that make up a human. Another prominent researcher in the area of human intelligence is Robert Sternberg, currently at Cornell University, I believe, a former president of the American Psychological Association, and he's known for his three-prong intelligence model. He posits that beyond the analytical intelligence, humans also possess practical intelligence and creative intelligence. And again, according to him, these are related but independent systems. Now we're moving on to a well-known intelligence model, Wechsler's model of intelligence that goes back to as early as 1939. The instrument that Wechsler developed was first used in the Army and public schools for measuring students' ability, but also for tracking purposes. Who is fit to be in which rank, who is fit to be in which class, and which group. So now Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Children, or WISC-5, is utilized in schools for children ages 6 through 16. It has been normed on over 2,000 children, and it has 10 core and 5 supplementary subtests. And the main number that is derived from the assessment is the IQ, or sometimes it is known as G, lowercase g. Now, an additional measure that I didn't include here is GAI, General Ability Index, and that was developed later in, I believe, 1998 or 1999 by the scientists at Pearson, where this test belongs to now. And it was an additional measure or an additional calculation that takes away the processing speed, and it helps give a slightly different insight into intelligence when some components that are heavily guided by attention are removed. So GAI may be used for students who are gifted, for students who are twice exceptional, and just an additional indicator. So here are the areas that WISC measures, and basically this is your model of intelligence. This is what the original author believes intelligence is comprised of. Your verbal abilities, your visual spatial abilities, fluid reasoning, working memory, processing speed, and like I mentioned, there is an option now of calculating GAI, General Ability Index. In the module resources, there is a short 6-minute video with an overview of WISC. It was made by some graduate student. I reviewed the video, and even though it doesn't have a lot of likes and a lot of hits, it actually is a pretty solid, nice introductory overview of the assessment, so I recommend you watch it. There is also a full document from the Pearson website itself. It shows a sample student being evaluated, but what the document does, it explains every subtest and what it means. So it's very useful if you want to dive deep and understand what is meant by each score for each component. So this is a quick slide for students who need a refresher to differentiate between percentage and percentile. And this is the normal distribution, also known as the bell curve. I have provided a great video that explains what the normal distribution means, what is one standard deviation above the mean, what is meant by 2 standard deviations above the mean, and how you can look at this graph and figure out your percentile. So for those of you who have forgotten or you never clearly understood what that meant, that video is a great baseline intro because it's really based upon the WISC and the normal distribution. So now this brings us to our assignment that goes along with the topic of intelligence and assessing human intelligence. So assignment 2 is about understanding and analyzing a gifted evaluation report. You will read a gifted evaluation report for a fictitious student, Rodney, who was assessed with WISC 5. So you will answer some questions about it, from some basic background questions. What was the purpose of the assessment? Who was Rodney? Age, grade, any notable details about the student, to understanding the scores. What were the scores? What were some relative strengths? What were some relative weaknesses? And finally, to the interpretations and applications of the report, because any assessment is only as good as its applications in terms of what can the teacher do to address the student's potential. So this will be written in APA style. Recommendations for the teachers and or parents, as you see fit, should also be referenced, and more detailed assignment descriptions and directions will be in the assignment section. Thank you. Bye.